pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Barbara Olshansky. You have her bio. It started. We've been talking today about national security in sort of the broader sense, talking about U.S. foreign policy, but now we're going to turn it a little inward and talk about some of the ramifications of our U.S. foreign policy on our own rights here in the U.S. But I just also want to point out, Barbara is she's a professor at the University of Maryland Law School and works in their international clinic, and has been working in Africa to work on water rights for people in Namibia. I always say the name wrong, so please excuse me. But so she has done a lot here domestically as well as abroad, and she's just a fascinating lady. But I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. That was very nice. Thank you all for having me here today, and thank you for listening to me. And you're all free to leave if you get way too depressed. I always have this anxiety before I start to speak. Well, I've always had that, despite 25 years of being in front of courts and people. But particularly when I'm talking about, the war on terror and what the United States has done. Both because how do I smush it all in? There's a lot. And how do I do it without making everybody in the room morbidly depressed? And I always think I should bring along like little bottles of like whiskey, and for those who don't drink, like big chocolate bars. Something to make people feel okay at the end of this. And I didn't bring any of that today, and I apologize in advance. Maybe we should save those little chocolate squares out there. There is a lot to smush in, and I'm going to sort of try and do this in outline form, and then let people ask questions. A little bit about the idea of the war on terror. First of all, you guys are so knowledgeable about so many things. So I'm going to speak as though you are as pretty much as up to date with me on the terminology, because it seems like you're up to date on the terminology about a whole range of things. So with regards to the war on terror, one of the things that is that fascinates law professors, and I won't really make any more comments about that, is this idea of a war, right? A war on what is a social political phenomenon, right? War is a very technical term. Under the laws of war, humanitarian law, war is when there is a conflict between two signatories to the Geneva Conventions. And that is an international armed conflict, right, between two states when they're fighting. What I used to think in the very beginning of the Bush administration is that people really weren't very bright, and what I not very long after that thought was, oh my God, they're brilliant and it's terrifying. The idea of a war on terror, what it enabled the Bush administration to put into play was an incredible expansion of the powers of the executive, of the president. Because when a war happens, the president shifts into this role as commander-in-chief, right? All of a sudden, all of the machinery of our military and intelligence community is at his hands, at his, everything moves at his behest. So if you call it a war on terror, all of that gets invoked. But if there's no actual military conflict happening, and there is no geographic limit to the war, right? It's a worldwide war on terror, right? So there's no geographic limitation. And there's no temporal limitation, right? Who knows when it's going to end? How are we going to know? And who's going to call it? Time, war on terror is over. Who's going to... So without the geographic or the temporal limitations on the war on terror, you have an executive that has taken and made available to himself all of the commander-in-chief powers on an ongoing basis every day ad infinitum. And that aggrandizement of executive power is the most terrifying and undermining issue that became a hallmark of the Bush administration, continues into the Obama administration, and it is the most undermining, in many ways, one of the most undermining at least, to our democracy here. Because it is the executive reigning supreme over Congress, over the judiciary, over everything. And that balance of power has completely evaporated in certain spheres of our life, and many more than we would normally think. And that is an imbalance that is not going away anytime soon. And I really believed, when I really worked hard for President Obama to get into office, I really believed that there was going to be a restoration of that balance of powers. And I was, in fact, very wrong. So that skewed view is what starts at the very beginning after 9/11. So within 2 days after 9/11, there is already in place, and this is quite astounding, Department of Justice and FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. And immediately after the creation of that, there is what eventually becomes the Roundup. The Roundup is the seizure and detention of Middle Eastern, Arab, Muslim men from all over the United States based on tips that came to a Joint Terrorism Task Force FBI hotline from Joe and Jane Citizen anywhere around the country. And some of the tips look like this. There's a whole lot of Middle Eastern men in a bodega on the corner in New York City. There shouldn't be that many men to run a little bodega like that. There's something going on, okay? All of a sudden, everyone's in custody. No lie. People were taken in the middle of the night from their homes. Their families were told, Agent Jack took them. Agent from where? No one knew. And people start disappearing all over the country. At that time, I was working for the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I had been for a long time. And I had been coincidentally working on a number of cases of discrimination against the Muslim community in New York, and all of a sudden I'm getting hundreds and hundreds of phone calls about people disappearing. My uncle, my son, my nephew, my father, my grandfather. People are disappearing everywhere, and we can't find them. We can't find them. We start at the local police station. We go to the main police station in New York City. We go to the FBI offices. We go to the Department of Justice. We go to immigration. They've vanished. Then we figure out, okay, we'll go to the jails. We'll go to the federal prisons. Nowhere. They're nowhere. And so what is this? This is the Roundup. And all of these people, all of them, and I'll tell you, there were at least 3,000 of them. How many we will never know, and I'll talk about that in 1 second, but all of them were held in prisons, mostly in federal prisons around the country, and the Department of Justice, this was our Attorney General John Ashcroft, actually instructed in writing and orally all of the wardens of all these facilities to lie to anyone that came to inquire about any of these people. It was a directive. And it meant not only to lie to lawyers, human rights lawyers, civil rights lawyers, family members, but to lie to foreign consulates if they were seeking to contact their own citizens. Okay, there's so many constitutional and human rights violations. Who knows where to start there? But a very big one is there, the Vienna Convention, right? Which is the thing that protects everybody around the world when you go into and ask for help from your consulate, right? It's the one thing that you always know, even in the worst horrible regimes, you can go to your consulate, right? And you can pretty much be assured that they're going to be on your side and you'll be protected as part of your country, right? That's what consulates do. None of them could find out where any of these folks were. It was astounding. This goes on for 6 weeks. And the only way we find out about it is when by coincidence, another person that we represent is arrested. And when we go to the federal prison in Brooklyn, he says, you know, there's another guy from Yemen that passed by my cell. And I said, what's he doing here? And he said, he's a terrorism suspect. Okay, that's when we start hearing and learning about where people are. What this eventually becomes is the situation where all of these people that were seized from all these different places and detained, they were never charged with any offense. Never. Not even jaywalking. They never made it in front of a judge. What they were being asked to do is to prove their innocence of any connection to any terrorist group. They had to prove a negative, right? All of a sudden, we have very quickly flipped our entire legal system on our head. You're not innocent until proven guilty. You're guilty until you prove your own innocence. And that really was the policy. It was written, it was clear, it's right out there, and that is what we did to thousands of people. And we kept those people. Some of those people didn't make it out of this detention until 2010. 2010. 9 years. They were 9 years in places where they just got lost in the system. We didn't get to them. Heaven knows how that happened. And we don't know how many, because at certain points the Department of Justice gave out numbers. Maybe the highest number was 2,800. But then when we filed the Freedom of Information Act case to find out how many, we lost. We won in one court, we lost in the other. When it went up, we lost. And so we'll never know how many. So what happened to these people eventually? Well, some of them were subject to a very unlovely departure from the United States. What the Joint Terrorism Task Force did in conjunction with the CIA is rent commercial jets. People were flown out of a state called Waterproof, Louisiana, and in the middle of the night, and they were taken back to their country of origin. Now, they were taken back without anyone looking at what their political status was in the United States. You can just imagine what happens, right? Because some of these people actually had political asylum in the United States, and we sent them back to where they were running from. They were U.S. citizens, and we sent them back. Some of those folks we have never been able to find. And this is just the first stage of what goes on. We eventually win 2 national lawsuits that say all of this is unconstitutional, but it doesn't make a difference because we can't sue anybody over what they did. We can't sue Ashcroft for lying. We can't sue him for violating the Vienna Conventions. The foreign consulates can't sue. Those governments can't sue. The families of these people can't sue. Because every time we try a lawsuit to hold any political person accountable, we get hit with the state secrets privilege, immunities, sovereign governmental immunity. We have built in this country a wall, brick by brick, that is so high and so solid that we are unable to hold anyone in this country accountable. Even the people that unilaterally changed the law on torture and authorized horrible things at the hands of the United States. Nope, we can't do anything. And just this past week, the Supreme Court kicked out the case of Jose Padilla, who was, remember that name from a long time ago? Poor Jose Padilla. Now, I represented him in the very beginning, and this is just a guy who became a Muslim in prison, a guy who was just sort of sad and a follower. He was so terribly beaten and solitary confinement in the naval brig did such terrible things to him. And yet, there was no way that the Supreme Court was going to find a way in for us to hold anyone accountable. We have, in every case where we've tried that, we've lost. So we have the roundup, and we have the guilty until you prove yourself innocent of terrorism connections. That's the roundup. What's happening at the same time? Well, the passage of that great Patriot Act, which has so many pieces moving all the time that there isn't a lawmaker anywhere out there that has a handle on all the parts of the Patriot Act. And it gets put in front of people really, really soon after 9/11, and it's huge, thousands and thousands of pages. It's like this tall. John Conyers calls me and goes, "I just want you to see what this is," and it's this big, and people think, oh, it's an act. Well, it's hundreds and hundreds of acts, maybe even like 1,000 different acts, amending existing laws, putting into place new laws, and they get it in the middle of September, and they are told that there's going to be a vote on it on October 26th. Nobody has a chance to even begin reading this, right, or digesting it. And how does this happen? There's a team. There's Donald Rumsfeld, John Ashcroft, and David Addington, and they go from office to office, and they tell people, if you don't sign this, we're going to call you out in public as a traitor to the United States. And literally, they do this. They literally do this, go to office and office, and it gets passed. No one knows what's in there. And for years afterwards, even to this day, there are still questions. We still get questions. We get calls from congressmen and senators' offices saying, there's a provision of the act. Does this actually mean? And it's like, oh my God, we are still dealing with that. So that's happening at the same time as the roundup. What's also happening? Well, we have an invasion of Iraq. And the invasion happens, and it doesn't take very long until that war is over. The war between those two countries, the United States and Afghanistan, the war ends on the date that we recognize the provisional government. Okay, in October 22nd, 2002. That war is over, right? Karzai is already the would-be president. The provisional government's in place. We've helped put it there. We've already shifted into state-building mode in Afghanistan. So there's no longer a war there. But that doesn't mean anything with regard to the war on terror. So while that is going on, we are arresting people from the battlefield in Afghanistan, but also from countries all over the world. And this comes to the place I work at, the Center for Constitutional Rights. We get a call from 2 Australian human rights lawyers and 2 British human rights lawyers saying, and we have parents that came to us that say that they think their son is in this naval base in Guantanamo. And we're like, really? And they say, yeah, because they have letters that have come from the International Committee of the Red Cross. So we have to decide at the Center for Constitutional Rights whether we're going to take this case, right? These parents to get their children. And the Center for Constitutional Rights isn't the ACLU. It's a political law firm, right? It's a progressive law firm. Some would have called it radical, but after we won Guantanamo, all of a sudden we became the norm. But it's we never represented the Nazis marching down Broadway. That First Amendment Bill of Rights orientation is what the ACLU does, and they do it very, very well. And that's not what we did. So we would make sure, okay, do we agree with our client's political view? Well, here we have George Bush saying, you know what? This is the worst of the worst. And we're like, oh my God, what if it really is the worst of the worst? What are we going to do? We don't know who the people are. We don't usually do this. And it splits us internally. There's not actually, at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of us, but I was just telling Amanda that we did a smoke and mirrors thing, and we never had any reporters upstairs. And we would just say, they'd say, how many people are on the case? And we'd say, well, there's, of course, 2 lead co-counsel, and then there's all these cooperating attorneys. And so we never told them that there's actually 4 of us. And you're not allowed to repeat that out of this room. So, but we're having this discussion, and we're really divided. What do we do? And then the next day, George Bush says, yes, we've opened a prison in Guantanamo, and it is a place where no law applies. No law, right? A legal black hole. Like all of a sudden you've dropped into a black hole, and anybody can do whatever they want to you. And well, that kind of did it for us. Like, uh-oh, now somebody's got to do something, right? Because even if they're monsters, we can't have a place on the planet where no law applies. And so what are we going to do? Well, we weren't looking to like start a battle over habeas corpus. You know, well, I'll get to the habeas corpus thing. What we were doing is we were asking the Bush administration, if you're arresting people on the battlefield, do what we always do under the Geneva Conventions. You hold a battlefield hearing. It's not literally in the middle of the battlefield. You just get officers there and you find out, is the guy a civilian? Is he a fighter? Is he a legitimate fighter? You know, if he's a if he's a fighter, you treat him as a prisoner of war. And if he's a civilian, he gets to go home unless he committed a crime, then he goes to prison. There's these rules. Just use the Geneva Convention rules. We had always used them. We'd used them in the first Persian Gulf War. We'd used them there. We'd use them all the time. Well, all of a sudden we're not using them. And so what we went in when we started that Rasul case, the first case for the Guantanamo detainees, is we just wanted a battlefield hearing. But, now there's all these people in Guantanamo. It's too late for a battlefield hearing, right? I mean, by the time, so when we filed the petition for writ of habeas corpus, and boy, have I learned a lot about habeas corpus since then. But we file it, we lose really badly, badly. And then we appeal in the Court of Appeals, in the D.C. Court of Appeals. And if you could lose worse than we did the first time, we did. And then we're like, okay, well, we just got to do it. We have to go up. And we petition for cert. And the first thing is, we think, is the Supreme Court going to hear this? Nah. And then it says yes. And when we go to argue, it's 2004. It's taken us that long to get up to the Supreme Court. And what's very interesting is the week of our argument is when 60 Minutes, the television news program 60 Minutes, gets hold of the information about the torture in Abu Ghraib. And the administration, and of course we hear about it because nice people are giving us information in various different ways. So we hear about this, and the administration asks them to not air 60 Minutes right before argument, the Sunday before the argument was happening, but to hold it until the next week. Well, big deal. What ended up coming out was so horrendous that it wasn't like it was going to, it was going to affect argument and not affect the court afterwards. But it came out at this very specific time. But even so, we didn't think that we were going to win this case. And then we hadn't even thought about what to do when, in fact, we do win. And the day that we win, the Center for Constitutional Rights, which has, everyone here is too young to probably know, it was started by a group of men that represented Martin Luther King at the very early stages of the civil rights movement all the way through, and has represented people in progressive movements around the world for years. And it was started by William Kunstler, right, a radical lawyer. So, that's where I'm working. For the most part, like all of the private law firms, if I'm involved with them, I'm suing them for some reason, for employment discrimination, for fraud, for consumers, so just everything. Now all of a sudden they are on my voicemail volunteering to represent Guantanamo detainees. It's the day after we win. Boy, was I shocked. And what's amazing is they came on the representation. There was like the first 11 firms, and we set up this process. And as part of the process, we give this training to all of these lawyers, and they get a group of detainees per law firm. Like, one law firm gets most of the Yemeni detainees. We try and group them, things like that. And we start representing people. And it's just really good that, there was that lag between when we won and when they first saw me, because when we won, I had magenta hair. And, between that and the nose pierce, I can just imagine what all of them would have said, because these were the managing partners of these very big Wall Street firms, and for the most part, Republican. And that is a very interesting issue in and of itself, about how participation in the Guantanamo defense has changed people's view of the world and of themselves, which I became an armchair or desk chair therapist hearing a lot about this. The Guantanamo defense goes through a million hurdles. Habeas corpus, everyone knows what habeas corpus is. It hasn't really changed from 1215, from the time of the Magna Carta. It says, if you're in prison, you get to ask the judge, why am I here? You get to force the king into the court and say, why did he slam you in the dungeon? And why did he throw away the key? And it's that simple. Habeas corpus is just, is there a law under which you are being detained? And have you violated that law? Right? That's it. That's it. If the answer is no to either one of those questions, the doors automatically swing open. There's nothing else that has to be done. That's habeas corpus. That's it. And so when we win the right to habeas corpus for the people in Guantanamo, the government automatically says they might have habeas corpus, but they have to do it by themselves. Mm-hmm. People in Guantanamo are from 49 different countries. The vast majority of them were illiterate. Certainly not all of them spoke Arabic. And, there's upwards of 700 people there. And they're supposed to do, and they have no knowledge of U.S. courts. They're supposed to do it by themselves. Okay, we win that one. And we win the right to go down there and to meet with our clients. But we don't win the right to meet them before a case is filed for them. Great. How do you represent somebody and file a case when you haven't met them yet? Yeah, Well, what you have to do is you have to find their next friend. And their next friend is a relative or a very close friend who agrees to stand in their place for a habeas corpus petition. We went on the road. We went all over the Middle East. We went everywhere we could. We did public service announcements. We held meetings in tents outside Sana'a, Yemen. We were in Bahrain, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, any place you can imagine, we went. My passport looks wild. And we met with parents, and we filed these habeas petitions. And this goes through lots and lots of permutations. And the government just keeps setting up roadblocks. But what happens eventually now? Periodically there's a scorecard that's published in the New York Times, which I always love when it happens, because I think we won like 97% of the cases. And we're not winning because, there is an issue. If it goes to federal court, and it goes to a real trial, what evidence can they use, because they tortured people? But what we're really winning on is the fact that either the Department of Defense had already said that they made a mistake in arresting the person, or the Department of Defense has decided that they were actually innocent. And so when that comes to light, that's how we win. And it's amazing. You know, it comes to a point where one of the majors, you know, this guy, General Olshansky, leaves his service at Guantanamo and says, you know what, at least 90% of the people there are innocent. And it's like, wow. And because of what was going on, it became very clear to the real military that what the Bush administration was doing was so destructive that it wouldn't even operate in our own soldiers' interest. If we did this to people, what was going to happen to our guys around the world? So all of a sudden, I'm having, like, you know, tea with Norman Schwarzkopf in Chappaqua, New York. It's like, what? I'm like meeting with generals and admirals because they're on our side. And the fight just still continues. And that fight still continues to this day. I deliberately didn't bring up the slideshow because I think everyone knows what the torture looked like in Guantanamo. In the beginning, people were kept in dog cages on the ground, all open on all sides to the elements. They were deprived of water and food, and they were bitten by rats and scorpions. And you can imagine what this did to very senior, you know, heads of corporate law firms when this is how they see that the U.S. is keeping people. Eventually, you move people into solitary confinement. People were beaten, you know, subjected to like music that made their ears bleed, you know, temperature extremes, interrogated for days on end, you know about the waterboarding. There were very, very prolonged hunger strikes, and so there was this incredible determined force-feeding effort that was made. And when they couldn't really get people to cooperate, even for the force feeding, they put them in a 6-point restraint chair, which has been ruled cruel and unusual punishment, by the way, in the United States. And they were shoving huge tubes up people's noses, you know, basically breaking their nose and then using the same one for other people and telling them that that person had AIDS. And it was just a mess. What we did there was a mess. And it became part of a kit bag of torture that was taken on the road to Iraq. So Guantanamo is the testing ground. And one of the things that becomes interesting as of all of this is the FBI is brought down to help with the interrogations because they're not going well. And to a person, every single FBI agent that goes down to Guantanamo stands back. What they say is they make a decision not to participate because they see torture going on. They refuse to do it, and they think also it's counter to getting any information. And this is now all documented in emails that eventually comes out, and it's quite amazing. So Guantanamo is, you know, we're 10 years later. More than 10 years later, it's still there. There's still more than 100 people there. Why are they still there? A number of reasons. Some of them are people that just hate the United States and won't participate in a Western legal system and won't accept representation by any of us or who are in the defense. And so they're there and they haven't figured out what to do with them because they're demanding that they be tried under Sharia law. Some people are there because the countries they come from refuse to take them back. Why? Not because they're terrorists, but because the effect of the detention and the mistreatment is that they have had complete personality breakdown. They have decompensated to the point where some of them are catatonic and unable to interact with the world and will need to be institutionalized and assisted for life. And these countries don't have the facilities for it, don't have the money for it, and the U.S. has so far refused to pay for it and refused to let them into the United States to be institutionalized here. And these are people, and there's also people that tried to hang themselves and weren't successful and had enough deprivation of oxygen to the brain that they're in a similar condition to the people who were catatonic. And you know what? The U.S. doesn't want the world to see who this little population of Guantanamo is. You can imagine why. And so how realistic was it for Obama to promise to close Guantanamo? You know, not really that realistic. Someone wasn't really telling him, you have to go down and see what this looks like, because. And so there are lots of issues still to be worked out there. What happens when, not long after we win the case in 2004, that starts all of this habeas representation, the Bush administration stops sending people to Guantanamo and shifts the air flights to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Unless you think that we've gotten out of the indefinite detention business, that is certainly not the case. I now represent people in detention in Afghanistan. In that one air base, there are at least 1,800 people, but the Warden General in Afghanistan, I can't even believe that I had dinner with the Warden General. Anyway, he says that there's closer to 9,000 people in U.S.-related detention in regional prisons around Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's, you know, that dwarfs Guantanamo, you know, by a serious amount. Those folks, we really haven't been able to get, we can't visit them. They can't get attorneys inside. They are not really getting trials. There's a whole bunch of people that have never seen their family, never, you know, heaven knows what goes on for them. And like the people in Guantanamo, there are many of them that we have picked up from different places around the world and brought there. And it's just a little bit of a detour from the extraordinary rendition program that the CIA ran, which is, you know, go with special forces, pick up the package in a country, bring the person to a place where they're interrogated under torture for us, and then send them off to Bagram Air Base. And yes, we did bring that suit, an extraordinary rendition case, on behalf of a Canadian of Syrian descent. His name was Maher Arar. He was intercepted between flights at JFK Airport, put in a closet, sent off in the middle of the night to Syria, where he had left when he was 16 to avoid military service with his family, and gotten citizenship in Canada. He's kept for 10 months in a concrete grave under the ground. And he finally gets out and tells his story. Canada, to their credit, holds a parliamentary inquiry, finds that he's innocent of everything, that there's been wrongdoing by the Canadian government, awards him $30 million, and makes him Man of the Year. We refuse to participate in any way that, you know, or respond to any request by the Canadian government. And we have since said in our courts that treating people like that is perfectly okay if they're a terrorism suspect. We've just turned everything on its head. Extraordinary rendition, indefinite detention, torture, and I'll just add this last piece, and then I'll try and say something very uplifting, I promise. You know, one of the things that Obama did that was really distressing is put into an executive order the indefinite detention policy that was in operation under Bush but never memorialized. And you know, for us that was astounding, just astounding. That indefinite detention policy is now in place. The probably one of the more distressing things for Americans to think about is the targeted killing policy that comes on the heels of the indefinite detention executive order. A list is developed of people that we think are bad guys. Obama issues a directive that permits assassination by drone. And we've been using drones, by the way, to kill people all over Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that, by the way, is how we end up killing many, many civilians. We killed we decimated families, wedding parties in the Bagram Valley. War crimes that exist against the United States are too many to mention. The first story that we know, though, is I'm so lucky. It was my client, Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen, young guy in his mid-20s, who grew up in San Diego, a surfer dude who went to San Diego State, got a master's, and worked in special education, learned about Islam, became a weekend imam, giving sermons with a whole bunch of other guys. And the Bush administration really liked him. Really progressive American, really progressive in his discussions about Islam and its relationship to the other faiths. And for some reason, when he goes to visit his father's family in Yemen, we tell them to arrest him and interrogate him. And he stays in prison in Sana'a for 2.5 years. And when he comes out, he's angry. And he gives lectures, sermons on the internet. And no matter how hard we in this country try to connect him to some act, to the goofy, very ineffectual Times Square bomber, to the guy who had something in his underwear, or I don't know, on a plane, we could never connect him to any of those people. He never talked to any of those people. He never advocated action like that. He never took a step towards anything like that. But he was put on our list. An American citizen. He spent his whole life here, except for those 2.5 years in Yemen, in prison. And we assassinated him by drone. We never charged him with an offense. He never had a trial. Extrajudicial killing of an American citizen has now happened, and it's happened because of what he said. And why people aren't more freaked out about that, I don't really know. When I talk to people in justice and I said, so, now if we had Malcolm X, in the Harlem Ballroom saying by any means necessary, and we didn't like that, and they go, sure, assassination by drone. I said, inside the United States? Absolutely. Okay, that's where I think I'm living on Mars now. But that is the state of affairs, and that is something that Obama has authorized. Okay, what's the uplifting thing? Sometimes the Supreme Court does great things, and I know it does have to do with the war on terror, but I couldn't leave you with just all of that. So, there was a great decision on Arizona's racial profiling law. 3 out of the 4 hideous, racist acts that were permitted by that law were struck down. 1 is still in place. They can ask you to find your papers if they have good reason to believe that you're there without papers. That's still awful. But the other 3 went out the window, and so sometimes the court is doing the right thing. At nearly the same time, the Supreme Court ends mandatory life terms for juveniles. It is cruel and unusual punishment to have a mandatory life term for someone that's committed a crime when they're a juvenile, which no one really thought we would win. So there is still some hope. So far, Obama hasn't done what Bush did, which is ignore decision after decision that comes out against him. That hasn't happened. And so there is hope. And so here's, I'll just be quiet now and say just one last thing. Having lived through all of this, and watched it, Some of it was horrible for me, but mostly it was horrible for all these other people. When I thought about doing something else with my life, I actually thought I could escape doing this, but that was wrong. I thought about teaching, and I thought about teaching for a couple of reasons. One is to make sure that there are people that came after me that were going to keep fighting. But the main thing that I thought about was that, a long time ago we stopped teaching people, kids in this country, about what it means to be a citizen. We all forgot, all of us. We forgot to watch our government. We forgot to hold people accountable. We forgot to stop the steamroller on all of our civil liberties. We just forgot that that's what we're supposed to be doing. And they were very good at manipulating the American citizenry to do this. That color chart about like where is supposed to be the high terrorist threat, and it's like, it goes up. I always like to ask people, so when it goes up and it's really high, like, what are you supposed to do? You wear like a hard hat to work, or you go into your desk, or you don't go to work. Like, what are you supposed to do? And there was never any direction. It was just a psychological tool to keep people afraid. And there was a lot of things like that went on. And so, for me, you're the hope, because you're our human rights troops on the ground. You teach people, and you teach them about what their rights are, what the rights are of other people, and what they should be watching for and who they should be. You get to ask them, who do you want to be? And for me, that you exist, that you're here, that you go out and teach all over the country, and this goes for teachers everywhere. You're my heroes, because there really isn't an answer right now to what we are, what this country has become, except the hope for change in the next generations. And I do have that hope. I have a niece and a nephew who are ready to take on the world, and it's you folks that do that. And so from the bottom of my heart, I have to thank you for giving me hope that it's going to be better. And that hope is what helps me get up the next day and hit my head against the wall another time. Thank you. Yeah.
So, you could ask somebody in the U.S. government and the CIA or any other agency, how do you justify these policies under the Geneva Conventions, under our Constitution? They'll pretty much always give you the same answer, which is that, these policies keep Americans safer. Because we've tortured, we've got intelligence that has saved American lives, or because of these drone strikes, our military didn't have to go in, and that saved more American lives and more casualties on the battlefield. So how do you respond to that when you hear that classic argument that the government uses?
Well, there's a lot of different pieces. The torture piece, people are not so quick to defend that these days, in part because the military, the real higher military, has really come out very strongly against torture, right? And the FBI is also very clear that you don't get valid information under torture. You get people saying whatever they need to say in order to have it stop. And so that just really doesn't work. So they're not so quick to say torture is great, even though, of course, the CIA is still torturing people. There's a manual on the web about how they taught people to torture, at the School for the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia. So we taught a whole lot of, South American dictators how to do this. And that you can go on and look at the manual, the CIA manual. But the other thing about, what keeps people safe in this country, right? It's very interesting. The Geneva Conventions are, treaties that the United States pushed for more than any other country in the world, and drafted, had the greatest role in drafting more than any other country in the world. And, when you know what they came out of, one of the most hideous periods in human history, and you know what they're there to do. So the question is, what the Bush administration said was, well, we can violate them because all bets are off. But if all bets are off, then all bets are off for everybody all over the world, not just the United States. And so, that the example that we have set now is that all of those laws which restrain everybody from acting like monsters, we don't feel constrained by. So why should anyone else feel constrained by them? Why should North Korea feel constrained? Why should Iran feel constrained? Why should, anyone feel constrained? And that's, that is, the question is, who fundamentally are we? And what are our beliefs? What was this country founded upon? In some ways, the answer is so easy. And it's not like judges haven't asked me that. And sometimes, I quote from the Declaration of Independence, and sometimes from the U.S. Constitution, almost always from the Federalist Papers. If you had told me that I would have memorized the Federalist Papers, I would have said you're completely nuts. But, there's a couple of them that I know by heart. And what we say to that is, who are we? That has to be the bottom line, right? And it's not like we haven't had terrorism in this country. There's Oklahoma City. There's Waco, Texas. This stuff has happened before, and it's happened to other places. And it doesn't mean that you flush democracy down the drain. And, somebody once said to me, so what is it about democracy? And, what's the trade-off? And there's, that old Ben Franklin saying, but it's the trade-off is democracy involves some risk, right? Some risk. In order to be free, in order to be moral, you have to take on some risk and trust people in the rest of the world. And our problem in the United States is that we have not been in the world community of nations for a very, very long time, maybe never. That isolationist strain that started way back when has continued until now. We don't even talk about Canada or Mexico. When does the news ever talk about that? Unless somebody's being, some college student is being dragged across a border. We don't look at ourselves as part of the world community of nations. And when historically, when we've taught students, what do you learn about the United Nations? Well, you get to go to a model United Nations thing with all these students. That's what I did. And then you get all the rest of your life, and all through law school, you hear that the United Nations is like nothing. It has no enforcement power. No one cares. It's nothing. Well, you know what? You step outside the United States, and actually countries care. And they pay attention. And they do things in accordance with, United Nations resolutions. It's amazing. And you go to the United Nations, and there's actually serious people there from all of these countries. And it's like, wow, what we don't know. And I think, that's the answer. That somewhere along the line, we really decided we don't want to take a risk. We don't really need anybody else. We have everything right here. We don't need anyone else. And we're not going to trust anyone else. And, then you're not part of the world. And democracy always involves some amount of risk. Yeah.
Listening to you is wonderful, but I'm thinking, what resources do we use in the classroom to teach the students what you just taught us?
Yeah, I was thinking about that today. What I would really love is, if someone's interested, I would love to work on what a curriculum would look like for this. I've done it, for particular specific issues, but I really would like to do that, because I don't think that there's enough out there, and I don't think there's enough for, you know, the full age range, you know, because I think when kids are 7 and you tell them, you know, this is what it means like to be a citizen and you should watch, it's cool what you see happens at 7. You know, all of a sudden I'm listening to the news and like watching what the president's saying. And because they're so open, their minds are just like huge and open, and they think it's cool. I get to say like whether it's cool what my government does. So, you know, there's, you know, a big age range, and I think it's really, really important to get it there, and I would love to work on it. And boy, if any, like, talk about a storehouse of information and evidence and facts, my office would probably scare people. But I have a lot, and I'm willing to work really hard to do something like that, yeah.
Did you ever think about connecting with the American Red Cross? Because 2 summers ago, I attended the seminar that they hold.
Yeah, the humanitarian seminar. I teach at it occasionally.
Humanitarian law seminar, and the modules are wonderful.
There's some really, really good ones. I've worked with folks in Northern California. Those don't, I mean, I think they're great, but they don't, you know, they're not for all of the different age ranges that people teach, you know. But they do have great ones, and I've worked on some of those. I like some of those. But I don't know that they're very discrete, short pieces, not a full curriculum.
I actually had a question, and
yeah.
The question was, we never did sign, the U.S. never did sign the Geneva Convention, did we?
Oh, yes. Oh yeah. There are 4 conventions. The third is the one that we've been arguing about the most, which is the one that deals with prisoners of war and the rights of prisoners of war. The 4th deals with all other personnel that might be incident to the battlefield, including civilians, but doctors and medical personnel. We sign them all. There are additional protocols, and the first protocol we didn't sign, but then what we ended up doing is acting under it anyway and accepting its rules by acting under it. And in addition, every manual for every sector of the armed forces has incorporated the Geneva Conventions as regulations that bind like that sector. So the Army's manual has incorporated the Geneva Conventions as their regulations. So they are incorporated into the law of the land.
How did Bush escape being prosecuted by the Attorney General?
Governmental immunity. You know, the Geneva Conventions require every government that's a signatory, and I think there's 194 signatories now, and I don't think there's too many countries that exist that aren't signatories, but it requires every country to adopt a national law that provides for the prosecution of people who commit crimes against humanity, war crimes and crimes against humanity. We had that on our books. What the Bush administration did as part of that package of Patriot Act, you know, terrorism, getting people to sign things, is get Congress to sign an amendment to our War Crimes Act that immunizes the government for all actions from some date back, back in the 1980s, all the way through the day before Obama took office. And that immunity, it just immunized everybody, every single person that took part in any of this. And in addition, when you try and sue them in other ways, and believe me, we have just tried every way till tomorrow, what we get back is, they can't go forward with the case because everything that involved in the case is a state secret. And to reveal it will put the whole country at risk, and the courts just go, okay, and the case is thrown out. So it's just not possible. However, if somebody, like Bush or Cheney or Rumsfeld or Addington, who are the architects of this, happened to get on a plane, and somebody happened to divert that plane to Switzerland, for example. This is my fantasy, of course. Then the Swiss U.S. government could arrest them and bring them to the International Criminal Court, and they could be tried because they have universal jurisdiction. They adopted the Rome Treaty, which created the International Criminal Court, and they took the further step of saying, and if you come in our country and you are a war criminal, you're dead meat. You're ours, and we're turning you over. And the only victory I've ever had is when I was at the United Nations in Geneva, and with the World Organization Against Torture, we put out a press release because we had heard Bush was coming to Bern, Switzerland for some meeting, and we pressured the Swiss government, and they put out a statement that said, as soon as he lands, he's going to be arrested for trial for war crimes before the International Criminal Court, and he canceled his trip.
Really?
But, that kind of felt a little bit good. But it's, there are a few countries like that. The United States did not sign the Rome Treaty. We are not part of the International Criminal Court system. And we went around pressuring countries around the world not to sign. But, a lot of them did. And some of them signed onto the universal jurisdiction provision, like in Switzerland. And someday, somebody's going to make a mistake, or the plane's going to have to land there for fuel or something, or I'll just give up my life and divert it myself. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
You've got such courage, personally. I mean, really, amazing. How did you got to go prepare your case before the Supreme Court? And how many lawyers were with you? Were you the lead lawyer?
Yeah.
And then the government had its representative.
Yeah, the government's representative is the Solicitor General. It always is the Solicitor General in these cases. In Rasul, and also at the same time Hamdi was heard, and Padilla. They were all heard together. And I worked on all of those cases. It was Ted Olson. And as people know, his wife died in the plane that went down in Pennsylvania on 9/11. But what was very interesting is, and I did not argue Rasul. Sometimes I really wish I had, but we made a decision, people that were working on a case, that we would do what was politically expedient, which was, there was a judge who was a Republican who had been the chief judge of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, John Gibbons, and he was retired from the bench, and he was really with us on the political issues, and we knew that he played golf with Scalia or something, and we just knew that they would listen to him because he was a lifelong Republican. Now he's a Republican in a very different sense. He's quite old by the time he argued in his mid-80s. But I'm so very glad that it was that we put him as the face instead of me. 30 years old and with this history of like being a granola crunching hippie human rights lawyer. Like I didn't want to risk habeas corpus. The judges all greeted him as a peer, and I think that made a difference. I think also Ted Olson sunk himself for their side, because at some point he said, he just looked at all the justices and he said, "You don't get to micromanage us." And I think it just slipped out because he was angry at the questions he was getting. And to a person, all of the judges, and they sit far across, all of them, because I just love watching the human interaction. So all of them just moved back in their seat just a little. It was almost imperceptible, but all of them did. And you knew, uh-oh, you just tried to tell the Supreme Court of the United States that they don't get to review executive behavior. Wrong. But I still didn't think we were going to win. But it was just like, wow, that was cool. They're all mad now. You take what you can get.
Was that decision just on those two cases, or was it a blanket type decision?
No, it was a blanket. It was actually, it was written by Justice Stevens, who was the institutional embodiment of the writ of habeas corpus. He had the most knowledge and had written all these very well-known opinions about the writ of habeas corpus, mostly in the criminal context. This was because no one was accused of a crime. This was the civil context, but he is the one that wrote the opinion. And
Was it unanimous?
no, but it was quite an amazing decision about what this country is about what habeas corpus is the most fundamental right. It's your individual liberty, right? That's the start of this country. That's the start of any country. That is, right? That's the most fundamental right you have. And of course, all of these machinations keep happening. And we eventually win this other case, Boumediene versus Bush, which goes through and sets this very elaborate test of how you figure out who gets the writ of habeas corpus. Because, Justice Stevens said, the people in Guantanamo definitely have it. And we went through all this proof. We've been there since 1906. We pay $1 rent to Castro. He rejects it. We have the right to keep that lease in perpetuity. There's a McDonald's there. There's it's Iowa. It's not Cuba. And in Boumediene versus Bush, the court set forth a very elaborate test of how you decide where the writ goes. And although that was a very, very good decision for us, it was troubling. How can there be a place where the United States government acts as a government where the writ doesn't go with them? It's, to me, this very intuitive idea. The writ follows the flag. Wherever we act as a government, it has to go with us. How can they act outside the scope of the Constitution and outside the scope of human rights and humanitarian law? They're not allowed to do that. But somehow that very basic idea, has not, it's not what came out of the court. And since Boumediene, we've had these terrible setbacks. And now, we have people who were found innocent in their habeas hearing in Guantanamo, and the Department of Defense has refused to release them, and the court has said its hands are tied. And so what does that mean about the continued life of habeas corpus? I don't know what's left of it after that.
Lincoln suspended it, no?
Yeah, that's a very, yes. For one person, Congress authorized it post hoc afterwards. And unlike a lot of other constitutional scholars or presidential scholars, I think Lincoln did a pretty messed up thing. Of course, it's in the context of the Civil War and all these other things are going on, and it's authorized after the fact, and people say that it was actually authorized before, but I don't like it. I didn't like it then. I don't know what to say now. We went back to 1215 and unraveled history. It's amazing. And what I wonder is, why are, sometimes, of course, it's in my head, but I think, why isn't every street in this entire city filled with people screaming that we're no longer a democracy? Who are we? I don't know. It's very weird. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about the men that you represented in Guantanamo, and I'm assuming that a lot of them were, found innocent and, oh, my bad, what happened to them? I mean, it's not like Delta just said, sure, how about that plane and we'll fly you home. So
it did happen, yeah.
So what happened to them? And do you still keep in touch with any of them? What are they doing now?
Well, so the first people that I should even start back earlier. The first people that got let out of Guantanamo was even before we won the case. It was when we found out that there was, at Guantanamo, there's a place called Camp Iguana, and that was for the children. And at the time, we had heard that there was children there who were 4, 7, and 9 years old, 9 and 11 years old. And I just went, bonkers. I think actually I might have told Donald Rumsfeld that I was going to sink my teeth in the back of his calf and not let go until he released them. I think that just came out of me. I don't know, like I turned into a bulldog. But they did, those kids were released, and of course the administration promised us that those were the only children. 2 years ago, they admitted there were at least 16 more. We have no idea where they were kept because, when you see Camp Iguana and you see how many beds there wasn't room for other kids. So, but we know there were other buildings, and then CIA Director George Tenet admitted that there were people who were kept entirely off the rolls in Guantanamo. They were never given an ISN, an attorney, number. They were never, the International Committee of the Red Cross didn't know about them, and so we don't know how many people came and went through that secret system. About the people that were released, so the first people that were released were Shafiq Rasul and Asif Iqbal, the very first clients that I had. And so when they were seized, they were on their way to Pakistan. Asif Iqbal was going to his father's village to meet his bride for an arranged marriage, and they were going to go to this sort of religious school, cultural school, and then he was going to come back to the UK to get married. And so he was 17, Shafiq Rasul was 16. They were released right before argument happened in the Supreme Court. And the other two, Mandu Habib and David Hicks, the Australians, the U.S. government was trying to get them released also, because if everyone was released, then the case was moot, and it would not be before the Supreme Court. And so that was this little legal wrinkle that's going on, and I filed something called an original writ in the Supreme Court, which has only been used once in the history of the United States for Brown versus Board of Education. And boy, did the court get mad at me for using the original writ. But anyway, those guys, when they were released in 2004, they went back to the UK that was really angry. The National Front, a really racist organization, put out a call for their heads, and they went underground. And they were underground for a very long time. They only very recently, came to the surface. There was a really wonderful man in the United States who felt so horrible about what we did to these kids, that he put in escrow all of the money they would need for a college education. And so those guys are going to college. I mean, for a lot of the people, that we had in detention that have been released, they're very badly scarred. And a lot of them come from cultures where, talking to a psychologist or a psychiatrist is just not really something that you do. And so what we've tried to get them is medical assistance, something that is sort of social working, that helping them reintegrate into work life and family life without sounding too therapeutic. And some folks are okay, or as okay as they can be. There's everyone has traumatic stress disorder. I mean, there's not really a person who hasn't, and it's very sad to see. There's some people who never get quite up to functioning, and if you're Afghan and you're going back to your family and you're expected as a man run the business, it's hard for families. And people are going to all different places all over the world, so many different cultures. Some people, we sent back to places that we shouldn't have. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. We sent 2 people back to Tajikistan, and the secret police there at the time were just, crazy. And they were boiling people in oil. And the UK ambassador to Tajikistan, who was then Craig Murray, said, he called me to tell me that they're gone. We wouldn't be able to talk to them again. So it's kind of a wide range of how people have responded to freedom after being, incarcerated in solitary confinement for such a long time.
Was there justification ever given for why a 4 or 7-year-old was incarcerated, and what was it, and then what happened to them when they
it's what we were told and what the real reason was. It's very difficult to know. What we were told is that they were somewhere near a battlefield, near military hostilities. People were being arrested. They had to take that child because they didn't know who that child belonged to. And then once they had the child, they really didn't know what to do, and so they just got swept up. And then they were going to figure out later what they were going to do with them and how to reunite them with the family. There were terrible, terrible problems with interpreters and translators, and part of that was just unbelievable ignorance on the government's part. I had an argument. My mother's from Aleppo, Syria, and I speak Arabic, and I had an argument with someone in the Department of State who said that, well, everyone there, we will be able to talk to everyone because everyone speaks modern standardized Arabic. That's a written language, not a spoken language, first of all. And second of all, there's dialects from everywhere in the world. And I can understand people from Lebanon and Jordan, but if I have to talk to somebody from Morocco, forget it. And here's this woman, and I ask her, do you speak Arabic? And she says, what did you say? Okay. This is not good. And so, their ability to even speak to the children or to some of the detainees was really very, very limited. No one had even heard of the language Uyghur for the Uyghurs, who were Chinese Muslims from the far western province of China, who were pro-capitalism, pro-democracy, and the Bush administration had been supporting them for years against the government of China, right? Great, we had this big capitalist movement in the western province, and then all of a sudden, somehow, 38 of them get arrested, and 6 weeks later, nobody could talk to them. They only speak Uyghur. And 6 weeks later, the Department of Defense decides, that was a big mistake. We arrested the wrong guys. How do you arrest 38 wrong people? I don't know. But they don't know what to do with them. And they start going to, country after country in Africa. And, they go to Gabon and say, will you take these Uyghurs, from Guantanamo? Gabon says, no. And we don't speak Uyghur. There's no Uyghurs here. These guys are what are you talking about? And, that's how the Uyghurs end up in Guantanamo for a really long time. Not because they weren't innocent. Everyone admitted after 6 weeks. And by the way, they didn't tell us that until years later. And, that was one day of vindication where a judge took the head off of the senior trial attorney, Terry Henry. I'd like to have it mounted on my wall. Anyway, because they lied when they said that no one was found innocent. And, of course, there was a lot of people who were. So the children, They were all Afghan. We had to hire a human rights investigative team to find their families and assist with them being reunited with their families once they were released. The government wasn't so great at doing that. I don't know what's happened to the other children that, we magically heard about like a year and a half ago.
I was wondering, I think there were a lot of us that sort of expected some of the Patriot Act stuff, some of the torture stuff to be scaled back when Obama went in office, and we're kind of surprised that he's sort of continued with these policies. What do you think is going on politically that's leading to that? Like what? Because he ran on this platform of this is bad, I'm going to get rid of it. Like what happened, do you think?
It's really hard for me to say. I think, I'm really, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a neurotic chick from Brooklyn, so I don't really know what happens around here. But, what I think is that, there's these political machinations, and in order to, probably get, one part of his platform passed, he has to be able to have this other flank satisfy the right. I don't know if it's something as much as basic as that, or and there are a lot of things that he's done that are good, right? All the people are being pulled out of Afghanistan, which is of course really good. But of course, there will be civil war there again, like right away. And so I don't know what we did other than set up the country for another civil war. But the things like assassination by drone, indefinite detention, I don't really know what to say, because we were so sure that was not going to be the rule of the day under him. All I could think of is, political dealing. I mean, I'd love to hear what other people think here, because I don't really have a clue.
Political experience.
I'm sorry?
I mean, what do you think the way, a lot of his decisions, what do you think is going to help him? Or his re-election, I'm sorry.
Expediency.
Well, I hold along by the skin of our teeth as far as winning on the war, as far as maintaining safety. Maybe we're more danger than
Yeah, so I'm an undergrad student at UC Berkeley studying human rights, and a question that
it's a great place to study human rights.
A question that the department tackles is universal human rights a reality? And this discussion kind of complicates it, because even though we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Guantanamo, the Geneva Conventions, it gets more complex, and I don't know what my opinion on it is yet, but I want to hear your take on it, because one side says that it's just a democratic ideal that can't be realized because the West is still committing these crimes.
Well, I guess, I think there's two questions. One is, what are, if there are universal human rights, what are they? And, the other half of my life, I work in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly in Namibia, Angola, and the Congo. And it's very, it's very clear to me that, that there are, very significant cultural differences between East and West and North and South, and so could you put a package together of human rights that exist across these cultures? Yeah, I think you could. I think there are basic things. Everyone agrees that people should be free, and not be slaves. But if you look at what the African Charter says, What the African Union, talks about. In Africa, human rights are much more collectivist. It's the people's rights, and things are put in those terms. So it's very different from a Western democracy idea. And so, have we all gotten together with input from everywhere to create what is the common set of universal human rights? No. Because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written at a time where Africa was not a part of it at all. And most of those states were still colonial states. And well, I think some of them still are neo-colonial states, because I think lots of countries control what happens in Africa besides Africans. But if you're talking about what happens now around the world, we're certainly not the best example of implementation of human rights treaties in this country, and across so many different treaties and conventions, from the ILO, from labor rights to to gender rights to race discrimination, you name it. And so can we say that that we have a culture of human rights compliance in this country? I could never stand up and say that in good faith. But does that mean that doesn't mean that there aren't all of us who are all part of the human rights movement who are fighting hard for them, right? Because what our government says and does is not, I hope, who we all are. And I really believe that when you talk to almost any person in this country on the street and you ask them, do you think we should be torturing people? I think the vast majority would say no. Because I don't think that's who we are as people in this country. But, that's probably the optimism that keeps me still doing this work. I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah, go.
One comment, though. There might be kind of an effort towards universal rights, but it's for specific people and governed by specific conventions. For example, the Geneva Convention specifically says what are the rights of soldiers, for example. And this cannot be done to them, this cannot be done to them. You cannot do this, you cannot do that. Now, if a soldier is in a foreign country and is captured, that country, if they are party to the convention, must do all the things that the convention says,
right,
and not do the things that the convention says you cannot do. But as you indicated, it's kind of like a dream to think that there is one general thing that deals with all humans across all cultures. Myself, I've seen it in the countries I've been in. A black person in America is different from a black person in England, is different from a black person even in Africa, in many, many of the different countries in Africa. And for sure, it's very different than any of the blacks in the Southern Hemisphere, like the Caribbean and South America and so forth. If we can't even come together on what it all means to just regions that are supposed to be civilized, then how will we cross cultures that have had histories of thousands of years of viewing things in a certain way? And so I would have answered, no, there is no universal.
Well, here's what I say to that. What I say to that is, that's the work for generations to come. And that's what I tell my students. Like when I stand up in law school, God knows if anyone tapes any things I say, and I say, this class is all about who do you want to be, and how do you want to be in this world. And that is the question that we have to keep asking and asking and asking until we get to that place where it is across all of those cultures, all of those differences, east, west, north, south, race, gender, and everything. And it's a long road. And you know, people much wiser and stronger than me said it much better about, you know, the long arc of history. And it's a long arc, and we'll be working on that for a long time.
One would have thought that religion would have been the one thing that could unite us, because the concept of a supreme being is in all of the religions per se. And being a good person as opposed to being a bad person is specifically defined in all of the religions. And one would have thought that that could have been an avenue, but even that is not a unifying, because we use it to be divisive and not as being a unifying force.
And you know, maybe what you're saying is, you know, there's something in human nature that will always prevent this. But I like to think that actually there is a core of genuine goodness in every person that can be reached. And we're still learning how to reach it. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. I wish we